London. The year is 1888, and in one of the most impoverished, crime-ridden districts of the city, Whitechapel, a gruesome series of murders is about to shake the world. A shadowy figure, known only as Jack the Ripper, would leave behind a trail of blood and terror. 5 women, victims of unimaginable brutality, would fall prey to a killer whose identity would remain shrouded in mystery. Who was Jack the Ripper? Was he a mere maniac driven by unrestrained madness? Or was he a highly organized criminal whose crimes were carried out with chilling precision? The case has fascinated and horrified for over a century, with more questions than answers. To this day, the identity of the killer remains one of the greatest unsolved mysteries in the world. In this video, we will take you on a journey through time. We'll explore the brutal details of the murders, the police investigation, and the many suspects that have surfaced over the years. But most importantly, we'll dive deep into the dark world of Jack the Ripper, unmasking theories that will shock you, examining forensic evidence that could change everything, and revealing new insights about this infamous killer. But first, let's begin by understanding the world in which these murders took place. To comprehend the magnitude of Jack the Ripper's crimes, we must first understand the social, political, and economic conditions of Victorian London. The Whitechapel district in 1888 was a place of staggering poverty and overcrowding. The streets were narrow, dirty, and filled with the stench of industrial pollution. Nearly 30,000 people crammed into a small area, with squalid tenements and filthy living conditions. Crime was rampant, and the police were overwhelmed. Whitechapel was a breeding ground for vice and violence, where desperate women turned to prostitution as a means of survival. The victims of Jack the Ripper were not just random women, they were women living on the margins of society, often working as prostitutes in one of London's most dangerous neighborhoods. These women, while largely invisible to the wealthier classes, played an unfortunate yet crucial role in Whitechapel's economy. They often found themselves in situations of poverty, abuse, and despair. This grim reality was a catalyst for the horror that would soon unfold. The murders began in August 1888. The first victim, Mary Ann Nichols, was discovered with her throat slashed and her body mutilated. The brutality of her murder was unlike anything the police had seen before, but it didn't stop there. One by one, the women of Whitechapel fell victim to the killer's savagery. Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and finally, Mary Jane Kelly, the last and most gruesome of the victims, each murdered with surgical precision, their bodies mutilated and their organs removed. As the killings continued, public panic reached a fever pitch. Londoners were gripped with fear, with whispers of a monster lurking in the shadows. The police were under immense pressure to solve the case, but the killer seemed to be always one step ahead. The press, eager for a story, dubbed the killer Jack the Ripper, a name that would haunt the history books. The press played a key role in the Jack the Ripper story. Journalists stoked public fear and speculation, while also reporting on every new theory, clue, and witness statement. The media frenzy turned Jack the Ripper into a household name, cementing his place in the annals of crime. The police faced a monumental task. They had no modern forensic tools, no DNA testing, and no reliable method for identifying criminals through fingerprints. The investigation was hampered by a lack of evidence, and witnesses often gave conflicting reports. Some thought they saw a man of high class, while others described a rough figure. The killer seemed to vanish into thin air after each brutal crime. Despite the public outcry, the investigation quickly ran into dead ends. The police were stretched thin and unable to make significant progress. While they considered various suspects, including local residents, doctors, and even prominent figures, none were ever definitively linked to the murders. So why does this case still capture our imaginations more than a century later? Why does Jack the Ripper continue to be one of the most talked about criminals in history? The answer lies in the mystery that remains unsolved. Despite countless theories, investigations, and the passing of time, the true identity of Jack the Ripper is still unknown. In this video, we will dig deep into the facts, the theories, and the endless speculation about who Jack the Ripper really was. We will explore the key suspects, from the most well-known to the most obscure. We'll examine modern forensic advances, including DNA testing and psychological profiling, and we'll look at how these new tools may help solve the case once and for all. Together, we'll explore the twisted enigma that is Jack the Ripper. As we move forward, remember this. The case of Jack the Ripper is not just a story of a killer, it's a story of fear, obsession, and the deep darkness that lurked beneath the surface of Victorian society. So, grab a seat, and let's begin our journey into the heart of one of the most chilling mysteries in history. The crimes of Jack the Ripper weren't just horrific in their brutality, they were tragic in their humanity. The 5 women who fell victim to this killer were not simply faceless victims of a random criminal, but real women, each with their own story, struggles, and lives. To understand the depths of the terror Jack the Ripper caused, we must first dive into the lives of these women and the gruesome nature of the murders that took them. These women, Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly, became known as the Canonical Five. They were the victims of Jack the Ripper's brutal rampage through the streets of Whitechapel in the autumn of 1888. Our story begins with Mary Ann Nichols, the first known victim of the Ripper. She was a 43-year-old woman who had fallen into poverty and turned to prostitution to survive. On the night of August 31st, 1888, Mary Ann was found in Bucks Row, a narrow alley off the main street in Whitechapel. Her body was discovered by a cart driver at around 3:40 a.m., lying face up with her throat slashed and her abdomen mutilated. The wounds were savage. The killer's method was already clear. There were signs that her killer had some level of anatomical knowledge, as the mutilation appeared precise. Yet there was no evidence of the killer's identity, and no eyewitnesses could come forward to offer any clues. Mary Ann Nichols's murder set the stage for the brutal spree that was about to unfold. It was the beginning of something far darker, and the fear that would soon grip London was only beginning to take hold. The second victim was Annie Chapman, a 47-year-old woman who, like Mary Ann Nichols, had turned to prostitution to survive. On the morning of September 8, 1888, Annie's body was discovered in the backyard of a house on Hanbury Street, just a short walk from the site of Mary Ann's murder. Annie was discovered with her throat cut and her body horribly mutilated. The killer had removed her uterus and placed it beside her body, which again suggested a deep knowledge of anatomy or surgical skill. This wasn't just a random act of violence, it was calculated, deliberate. The same brutality that marked Mary Ann's murder was repeated in Annie's death, and the terror that gripped Whitechapel began to grow. What makes Annie Chapman's murder even more chilling is the proximity to the first killing. Was Jack the Ripper returning to the same area, or was there something more sinister about the timing of the crimes? Elizabeth Stride, a 45-year-old Swedish immigrant, became the third victim of the Ripper on September 30th, 1888. Elizabeth was found in Dutfield's yard, off Burner Street, at around 1 a.m. At first glance, her murder seemed to follow the same pattern as the others. Her throat had been slashed. But there was one crucial difference. Unlike the previous victims, Elizabeth Stride's body showed no signs of mutilation beyond the throat wound. There were no abdominal cuts, no organ removals. Some believe this may have been due to the killer being interrupted during the act. Witnesses reported hearing a scream around the time her body was found, and some speculate that the Ripper may have been disturbed by someone approaching, causing him to flee before completing his grisly task. The lack of mutilation in Elizabeth's murder led some experts to believe that she was not intended to be the final victim of the night. Could the Ripper have had a different victim in mind, but was interrupted? Or was Elizabeth Stride's murder a mistake in the Ripper's pattern? Later the same night, September 30th, 1888, a night that would later be known as the double event, the Ripper claimed his fourth victim, Catherine Eddowes. Catherine was a 46-year-old woman with a history of alcoholism and a troubled life. Her body was found in Mitre Square, just a short distance from where Elizabeth Stride's body had been discovered. Catherine's murder was even more brutal than the others. Her throat was slashed, and like Annie Chapman, her abdomen was mutilated. The Ripper had removed her kidney and placed it on her shoulder. Perhaps the most chilling detail was the blood-smeared wall nearby, suggesting that Catherine's killer was not just a cold-blooded murderer, but someone who relished in the act of terror. What made this night particularly horrific was the double event. Two women, brutally murdered within hours of each other. The killer's increasing violence and his apparent ability to move through the streets of Whitechapel unnoticed suggested an intimate knowledge of the area, and possibly even a sense of invincibility. Mary Jane Kelly was the last victim of the Jack the Ripper murders, and her death was the most gruesome of them all. Mary Jane, just 25 years old, was a prostitute who had spent much of her life moving from place to place. On November 9th, 1888, she was found in her room at Miller's Court, a small area tucked behind a row of houses in Whitechapel. Unlike the previous victims, Mary Jane Kelly was not found in a public area. She had been murdered in the privacy of her own room, and the scene was nothing short of horrific. Her body had been mutilated beyond recognition, with almost every organ removed. The level of violence and the meticulous nature of the dissection suggested that the Ripper had complete control over his victim, and that he had become more brazen and confident with each kill. Mary Jane Kelly's murder marked the end of the canonical Ripper murders. Her death was the final gruesome act in a spree that had left London in fear and the police helpless. The Ripper was never caught, and his identity remained a mystery. The victims of Jack the Ripper were not just numbers or headlines. They were real people with lives, families, and stories of their own. Their deaths were brutal, and the terror they felt in their final moments is something that has haunted London for over a century. These 5 women were the Ripper's victims, but the horror of their deaths cast a long shadow over Whitechapel, and indeed the entire city. Their stories are etched into the history of one of the most infamous killers the world has ever known. But while their lives were cut short, their story is far from over. The search for Jack the Ripper continues, and new theories and modern investigations offer fresh hope in solving the case once and for all. The murders of Jack the Ripper left not only a trail of blood, but also a trail of confusion, missteps, and failures. While the police worked tirelessly to uncover the identity of the killer, they were faced with numerous challenges that limited their effectiveness. The task seemed insurmountable. To catch a killer who was always one step ahead, slipping through the cracks of an overcrowded, crime-ridden district without leaving behind enough evidence to make an arrest. The police force in 1888 was not the modern, well-funded institution that we think of today. They lacked the forensic tools we now take for granted. There were no fingerprint databases, no DNA testing, and no psychological profiles. The police were left to rely on witness statements, forensic observations, and old-fashioned detective work. But with little evidence, they were often forced to chase shadows and rumors. The first murder, that of Mary Ann Nichols, was discovered early in the morning on August 31st, 1888. Almost immediately, detectives began their investigation, questioning witnesses, canvassing the area, and trying to determine who could have committed such a brutal crime. Despite the early efforts, there were no immediate leads. The crime scene was carefully examined, and the pathologists who inspected the body could not find any distinct clues as to the identity of the killer. The mutilation, though horrifying, was not enough to point to a specific type of person or profession. and with no witnesses to provide a description, the investigation quickly turned cold. As the killings continued, the police began to realize that they were up against something far more dangerous than they had initially thought. The brutality of the murders escalated, and the killer seemed to have a deep knowledge of the human body. The removal of organs from the victims in such a precise manner pointed to the possibility that the murderer might have had medical knowledge. Yet despite this, no clear suspect emerged. The police cast a wide net, questioning local residents including doctors, butchers, and anyone with possible anatomical knowledge. A number of potential suspects were brought in for questioning, but none of them turned out to be the killer. The police were left with little to go on and little hope of finding the murderer. Just when the investigation seemed to stall, something strange happened. In September 1888, a letter arrived at the offices of the Central News Agency, signed with the now infamous name, Jack the Ripper. The letter was filled with taunting language and graphic descriptions, claiming responsibility for the recent murders. The letter was addressed to the press, and it was only the first in a series of communications that would continue over the coming weeks. Some of these letters were obviously hoaxes, written by attention-seeking individuals looking to insert themselves into the story. But others seemed eerily authentic, and many believed they were indeed from the killer himself. The letters sent by Jack the Ripper fueled the public's fear, turning the killer into a notorious figure and inspiring widespread panic. The press capitalized on this fear, running sensationalized stories that only deepened the hysteria. Police were now under intense public scrutiny, but their ability to find any meaningful leads remained minimal. As the investigation continued, the police found themselves overwhelmed. The Whitechapel district was a maze of narrow streets, alleys, and dark corners. There were dozens of brothels, taverns, and lodging houses, each teeming with potential witnesses, yet many of these individuals were either unwilling or afraid to speak up. Fear of reprisals or suspicion from the police kept many people silent. Moreover, the police had no reliable method of identifying suspects. With no forensic evidence to work with, they relied on eyewitness testimonies, which were often contradictory and unreliable. One witness might describe the killer as a man of high social standing, while another would claim he was a rough, scruffy figure. The descriptions never seemed to match, and no one could point to a specific suspect. Among the detectives working on the case was Inspector Frederick Aberline, one of the most notable figures in the investigation. Aberline was a seasoned officer with a sharp mind, and he quickly became one of the key figures in the hunt for Jack the Ripper. However, even Aberline's skills were tested to the limit as the case grew more complicated. Aberline and his team chased down leads, interviewed hundreds of suspects, and followed every possible clue. But their efforts were ultimately futile. Despite the large number of suspects, including individuals like Aaron Kosminski, Montague John Druitt, and Francis Tumblety, none of them were definitively linked to the murders. The police had no choice but to admit that they had no idea who Jack the Ripper was. As the case dragged on, public distrust of the police grew. The murders seemed to be happening on a regular basis, with no progress being made in the investigation. The press, ever hungry for more sensational stories, became increasingly critical of the police's failure to make an arrest. Public pressure mounted, and some even questioned whether the police were hiding something, or worse, were complicit in the killings. The failure to catch the killer was embarrassing for the police, and the pressure became so intense that rumors began to spread. Some people suggested that the Ripper was a man of high social status, possibly even a member of the royal family. Others believed the killer might have been a doctor, given the surgical precision of the murders. These wild theories, combined with the police's inability to solve the case, only added fuel to the fire. By the end of 1888, the police had essentially run out of leads. The killings stopped abruptly, and for reasons we may never fully understand, Jack the Ripper disappeared from the streets of Whitechapel. The police were left with a sense of frustration and failure. They had never caught the killer, and the case went cold. Despite the growing number of theories, new investigations, and modern forensic analysis, Jack the Ripper's true identity has never been conclusively discovered. The case remains one of the most chilling unsolved mysteries in history, and the failure of the police to capture him only adds to the legend of Jack the Ripper. Amid the terror and confusion of the murders, another element emerged that would deepen the mystery of Jack the Ripper: the letters. These letters, purportedly sent by the killer himself, would become infamous in the history of the case, fueling public fear and creating a media frenzy that would haunt the investigation for years to come. The first letter from Jack the Ripper arrived in September 1888, shortly after the second murder. It was addressed to the Central News Agency, and its contents were chilling. The letter was taunting and crude, filled with violent language and bizarre threats, signed with the name that would forever be associated with the killings: Jack the Ripper. The letter claimed responsibility for the murders and was filled with taunts aimed at the police. It was detailed, including specific references to the first murders, and it suggested a sadistic thrill the killer derived from the terror he was causing. The public's first glimpse of Jack the Ripper's personality was through these letters, and it left a lasting impact on how the case would be perceived. But the letters weren't just chilling in content. They also presented a puzzling mystery of their own. At least 6 letters are believed to have been sent by the killer, but only a few are considered authentic. Some experts argue that the letters were sent by someone other than the Ripper, perhaps a prankster or an attention seeker, but others believe they provide valuable insight into the killer's twisted mind. The tone of these letters ranged from boastful to threatening, with some describing gruesome details of the murders that hadn't been released to the public. The Dear Boss letter, one of the most famous, was written in a mocking tone, as though the killer was taunting the police for their inability to catch him. In one of the most infamous sections of the Dear Boss letter, the killer writes, "I am down on whores, and I shan't stop ripping them until I do get buckled." The casual nature of this line, along with the chilling signature, sent shockwaves through the public and law enforcement alike. The killer seemed to relish in his infamy, almost daring the police to find him. But as the letters continued to pour in, it became clear that not all were authentic. Some of the letters were clearly hoaxes, written by people eager for attention or to contribute to the hysteria. The Saucy Jackie letter, which claimed to be written by the killer, was one of the most famous hoaxes, playing on the killer's reputation and the media's obsession with the story. The press played a pivotal role in shaping the Jack the Ripper narrative. The London Evening News and other newspapers, eager for the next sensational detail, ran daily stories on the murders and the letters. They painted the killer as a figure of dark legend, and the more letters that were received, the more the public became fixated on the myth of Jack the Ripper. The media coverage became a frenzy, with sensational headlines, graphic descriptions of the murders, and constant speculation about the killer's identity. The press became obsessed with the letters, as they were a way for the public to feel closer to the mystery, even though they offered no real clues. The press's obsession with the letters only served to deepen the public's fear. Every time a new letter arrived, it was front-page news. The killer was no longer just a shadowy figure lurking in the streets. He was now an iconic figure, a boogeyman who seemed to taunt law enforcement, the public, and the media with his every move. With each new letter, the sense of panic in London grew. People became afraid to walk the streets, particularly at night. The public began to scrutinize every detail of the case, from police reports to eyewitness testimonies. They were desperate for answers, but all they had were more letters, more media coverage, and more fear. For the police, the letters presented a challenge of their own. The first few letters appeared to be genuine, but as the hoaxes started flooding in, it became increasingly difficult for investigators to determine which were real and which were fabrications. Despite the detailed descriptions, the police had little to go on, and the letters often led them down dead ends. The letters did not offer any concrete clues, and they seemed to serve more as a psychological weapon. The killer's taunts and graphic descriptions only increased the pressure on the police, who were already struggling with a lack of evidence and leads. The letters acted as a psychological game between the killer and the authorities, with the killer always staying one step ahead. One of the most chilling letters sent by Jack the Ripper was the From Hell letter, which arrived in October 1888. This letter was particularly disturbing because it was accompanied by a small parcel containing a human kidney, allegedly from Catherine Eddowes, one of the Ripper's victims. The letter read, "From hell. I send you the half the kidney I took from one woman, preserved it for you. The other piece I fried and ate it. It was very nice. I may send you the bloody knife that took it out if you only wait a while longer." This letter was undeniably sinister, and it seemed to confirm the killer's gruesome connection to the murders. The police were horrified, but again, they were left with no real way to track down the killer. The letter was postmarked from a different area than the murder site, and it didn't offer any clues that could have led to an arrest. The letters left a lasting mark on the Jack the Ripper case. They created a myth around the killer, making him more than just a murderer. He became a symbol of terror, an unstoppable force taunting the authorities and the public alike. The mystery surrounding the letters continues to fascinate researchers, historians, and crime enthusiasts to this day. But while the letters added layers of complexity to the case, they also masked the real issue: the lack of concrete evidence and the continuing failure of the police to solve the murders. And yet, the legend of Jack the Ripper, as nurtured by these letters, lives on in the public's imagination. As the murders continued, the police were under immense pressure to catch the killer. But without any concrete evidence or reliable witnesses, the task seemed insurmountable. The investigation quickly expanded, and several suspects emerged over time, with the police, the media, and the public all weighing in with their theories. In this section, we'll take a closer look at some of the key suspects who were investigated during the early days of the case and explore the theories that emerged about Jack the Ripper's identity. By the time of the third murder, the police were overwhelmed. With little evidence and an ever-growing list of potential suspects, investigators cast a wide net, considering hundreds of individuals. But as the killings grew in notoriety, the question remained: who could commit such gruesome acts? One of the most prominent suspects in the early days of the investigation was Aaron Kosminski, a Polish Jewish immigrant living in Whitechapel. Kosminski was a 23-year-old barber with a known history of mental illness, which some believed could have been a factor in the murders. He was known to have violent tendencies and had been institutionalized after the murders stopped. In fact, some police reports at the time suggest that he was considered a prime suspect in the case. Kosminski's connection to the murders was largely based on circumstantial evidence, such as his proximity to the crime scenes and his history of violent outbursts. Some experts argue that he may have been the killer because of his apparent lack of empathy and his fits of rage against women, which were described by those who knew him. In recent years, some forensic experts have revisited Kosminski's possible involvement using modern DNA analysis. A shawl found at the crime scene of Catherine Eddowes, one of the Ripper's victims, was tested for DNA in 2014. The results suggested a possible match to Kosminski's relatives, reigniting the debate. However, many researchers question the validity of this evidence, and it remains a topic of significant controversy among Ripperologists. While the DNA results have provided some intrigue, Kosminski's role as the Ripper is far from conclusive. Was he truly the killer, or was he just another unfortunate man caught up in the hysteria of the time? Another fascinating suspect is Walter Sickert, a renowned British artist whose disturbing paintings became a focal point for Ripper theories. Sickert's obsession with violence, death, and the human body seemed to parallel the gruesome nature of the Ripper murders, and some have suggested that his works may offer clues to his involvement. Sickert's paintings, which often depicted crime scenes and figures in distress, have been analyzed by Ripper theorists who argue that the artist had a strange fixation on the Whitechapel murders. Some even claim that certain details in his art could be interpreted as coded references to the killings. Sickert's connection to the murders isn't just based on his art. Some suggest that his personal life and behavior raise suspicions. Sickert was known to have been in the Whitechapel area during the time of the murders, and he had a strange relationship with the press and the public's growing fascination with the case. Some have even claimed that Sickert might have written some of the infamous Ripper letters. The theory that Walter Sickert was Jack the Ripper was popularized by author Patricia Cornwell, who wrote a book in 2002 suggesting that Sickert was the killer. Cornwell's research, however, was widely criticized for its speculative nature and lack of concrete evidence. Yet the theory has maintained a level of intrigue for those captivated by the idea of an artist concealing a dark secret. Montague John Druitt is another suspect whose connection to the murders is largely tied to his sudden death. Druitt was a barrister and teacher who lived in the area and was found dead in the Thames River in December 1888, just weeks after the last known Ripper murder. Some investigators at the time believed that Druitt's suicide was the key to solving the case. The Ripper's murders had stopped abruptly, and Druitt's death seemed suspiciously timed. In fact, a police official named Sir Melville McNagton included Druitt as a potential suspect in his report, citing the timing of his death and his unstable mental state. Druitt's connection to the murders, however, was purely circumstantial. There was no direct evidence linking him to the crime scenes, and his death by drowning could have been unrelated to the killings. The idea that his suicide marked the end of the murders is an intriguing theory, but it remains speculative at best. Francis Tumblety, an American quack doctor, is another suspect who has attracted attention over the years. Tumblety was in London at the time of the murders and was arrested for unrelated charges during the investigation. His known misogynistic views, his eccentric behavior, and his mysterious departure from London shortly after the murders ended have made him a suspect in some Ripper theories. Tumblety was known for his unorthodox medical practices and had a hatred for women, which led some to believe he might have been the killer. The police had a theory that the Ripper's murders were driven by a deep misogyny, and Tumblety seemed to fit that profile. Tumblety's connection to the murders, however, remains circumstantial. He was never formally charged with the killings, and there is no direct evidence linking him to the crime scenes. His role as a suspect is based more on his behavior and the circumstances surrounding his time in London. Perhaps the most sensational theory of all is the royal conspiracy. Some believe that Jack the Ripper wasn't just an ordinary man, but a member of the British royal family. The theory suggests that Prince Albert Victor, the Duke of Clarence, was the killer and that his crimes were covered up by the royal family. The theory centers around the idea that Prince Albert Victor was mentally unstable and involved in a secret relationship with a prostitute. The theory suggests that his violent behavior was concealed by the royal family to protect their public image, and that the Ripper killings were part of a cover-up. While this theory has captured the imaginations of conspiracy theorists, there is no solid evidence linking Prince Albert Victor to the crimes. It remains one of the most controversial and widely debated theories in the history of the Ripper case. Despite the many suspects, theories, and investigations, the true identity of Jack the Ripper remains unknown. From the mentally unstable to the royally privileged, the possibilities seem endless. And as time goes on, more suspects will undoubtedly emerge, each one adding to the tangled web of mystery surrounding the case. But the mystery of Jack the Ripper is more than just about solving a crime. It's about the fear, the myths, and the shadowy legacy that has lingered for more than 130 years. In the next sections, we'll explore the psychological profile of the Ripper, modern forensic investigations, and whether the truth will ever be uncovered. Stay with us as we continue this journey into one of the most chilling mysteries in history. To truly understand the case of Jack the Ripper, we must go beyond the facts and explore the twisted mind behind the murders. What motivated him? What drove a man to commit such horrific acts of violence? Was he a remorseless psychopath, or did his crimes have deeper psychological roots? In this section, we'll delve into the psychology of Jack the Ripper, examining his possible motivations, behavior, and the characteristics that define him as one of the most infamous criminals in history. To begin our psychological journey, let's first examine the nature of the crimes. Each of Jack the Ripper's victims was brutally attacked and mutilated. The Ripper's modus operandi, slashing the throats of his victims before mutilating their bodies and removing organs, was not only horrifying but also demonstrated a level of control and sadistic pleasure. The precision of these murders suggests a cold, calculating mind, capable of both planning and executing horrific acts with a disturbing sense of detachment. One of the most widely discussed psychological profiles of Jack the Ripper is that of a psychopath. Psychopathy is characterized by a lack of empathy, guilt, or remorse, as well as superficial charm and manipulation. Psychopaths are often driven by a need for control, domination, and power, and their crimes can be chillingly calculated. Jack the Ripper's ability to carry out these murders in such a calculated manner, without remorse and seemingly without any personal connection to his victims, points to a man who was detached from the humanity of those he killed. He preyed upon the most vulnerable women in society, choosing prostitutes who were marginalized and invisible to the rest of society. His lack of regard for the victims' lives suggests the presence of psychopathic traits, particularly in his sadistic need to dominate and dehumanize them. The act of mutilating the bodies of his victims also points to a desire for power and control. It wasn't just about killing, it was about asserting dominance, about marking his victims in a way that left a permanent impression. The surgical precision with which he removed organs and the way he staged his victims suggests that Jack the Ripper derived a deep sense of power from his acts. This need for control is a hallmark of many serial killers, especially those who fall under the psychopathic profile. Psychological experts who have studied the case over the years believe that Jack the Ripper's murders were not spur-of-the-moment crimes. Each murder was carefully planned, executed, and carried out with the intention of maximizing terror and exerting control over his environment. The victims were chosen specifically for their vulnerability, and the crime scenes were organized in a way that reflected a disturbing need to dominate and degrade. Another psychological theory surrounding Jack the Ripper is the presence of sadism, a desire to inflict pain and suffering on others for sexual gratification. Sadistic killers typically derive pleasure from the torment of their victims, and the gruesome nature of the Ripper's murders suggests that he may have found sexual pleasure in the violence itself. The way the Ripper mutilated his victims' bodies, particularly the removal of organs, could indicate a desire to assert control over the victim's sexuality. Some experts suggest that the Ripper saw women as objects, devoid of humanity, and that his crimes were a manifestation of deep-seated misogyny and sexual rage. He may have been driven by fantasies of dominance, punishing the women he targeted as a form of both sexual and emotional gratification. The fact that the Ripper's violence escalated over time, with each murder becoming more gruesome and the mutilations more severe, indicates that his sadistic tendencies may have grown stronger with each victim. Serial killers often evolve, with their fantasies becoming more extreme and their need for control intensifying. One of the most chilling aspects of Jack the Ripper's psychology is his apparent lack of empathy. He did not appear to feel any remorse for his actions, nor did he show any hesitation or fear of getting caught. This detachment from the suffering of others is another hallmark of psychopathy. For the Ripper, his victims were nothing more than tools to satisfy his needs, and their deaths were simply means to an end. The Ripper's complete detachment from his victims, both in terms of his emotions and his actions, suggests a profound lack of empathy. This inability to connect with others emotionally may have allowed him to commit such heinous acts without guilt. For someone like Jack the Ripper, The murders were not a source of emotional conflict. They were a game, a means of exerting control and dominance. In the years since the murders, modern criminal profiling has provided new tools for understanding the psychology of serial killers. These techniques, which were not available during the Victorian era, focus on behavioral patterns, psychological analysis, and crime scene analysis to build a profile of the perpetrator. Experts who have studied Jack the Ripper's case through the lens of modern profiling believe that he was a highly organized killer. He likely had a certain amount of social skills, which allowed him to blend into the community and avoid detection. Yet, his need for control, coupled with his lack of empathy and sadistic tendencies, made him a dangerous and unpredictable figure. While the exact psychological profile of Jack the Ripper remains speculative, modern profiling has given us valuable insights into his personality and behavior. The fact that he was able to commit such violent acts without showing signs of remorse or fear, and that he appeared to enjoy the violence, indicates that he was a highly disturbed individual, driven by his own dark fantasies. The psychology of Jack the Ripper remains one of the most complex aspects of this case. His sadism, lack of empathy, and need for control make him a chilling example of a psychopathic killer. But while modern psychology can offer us insights into his potential motivations and behaviors, the true nature of his mind remains an enigma. Jack the Ripper's psychological profile is as elusive as the man himself. We may never know exactly what drove him to commit such horrific acts, but his legacy continues to haunt us. The terror he instilled in the streets of Whitechapel and the fear he sowed in London is still felt today, as we continue to search for answers in the shadows of history. Over 130 years have passed since Jack the Ripper's reign of terror, but the quest to unmask this elusive killer has never stopped. With each passing decade, the tools and techniques available to investigators have improved dramatically. Forensic science, which didn't even exist in the Victorian era, has provided us with new ways to analyze the evidence and piece together clues that could finally lead us to the truth. In this section, we'll explore how modern forensic advancements have impacted the investigation into the Ripper case, and the reasons why, despite all of these advances, the case remains unsolved. Forensic science has come a long way since the days of Jack the Ripper. In the late 19th century, the police had no DNA testing, no fingerprinting techniques, and no reliable methods of forensic identification. Yet, even in the absence of modern tools, the case of Jack the Ripper continued to captivate the world. Now, with advances in criminal profiling, DNA analysis, and forensic technology, new possibilities for solving this cold case have emerged. But even with these tools, the passage of time and the absence of concrete evidence remain significant obstacles. One of the most groundbreaking forensic techniques to emerge in recent years is DNA testing. While DNA analysis was unheard of in the 1880s, it has now become a powerful tool for solving cold cases. In the case of Jack the Ripper, DNA testing has offered some tantalizing possibilities, although it has also been the subject of significant controversy. In 2007, a shawl was discovered at the crime scene of Catherine Eddowes, one of the Ripper's victims. This shawl was allegedly found near her body, and it has become one of the most famous pieces of evidence in the case. In 2014, DNA samples were extracted from the shawl, and the results seemed to suggest a possible match to the descendants of Aaron Kosminski, one of the early suspects in the case. Kosminski, a mentally unstable Polish-Jewish immigrant living in Whitechapel, was one of the prime suspects at the time of the murders. The DNA results, though intriguing, have been heavily disputed. Critics argue that the evidence is inconclusive and that contamination could have occurred during the handling of the shawl. Despite the controversy, the possibility that Kosminski may have been the killer has reignited interest in his role in the murders. While DNA testing has provided some clues, it also raises new questions. The lack of viable DNA samples from the original crime scenes, the degradation of evidence over time, and the issues with contamination all present challenges for modern forensic experts. The results are far from definitive, and so, the question remains, can DNA analysis ever truly solve the mystery of Jack the Ripper? Forensic pathology has also played a crucial role in understanding the murders of Jack the Ripper. Modern forensic pathologists are able to look at historical records and autopsy reports to analyze the severity of the injuries and the methods used in the murders. By examining the nature of the wounds, experts can determine whether the killer had medical knowledge and what that might suggest about his profession. The precise nature of the mutilations, especially the removal of organs, strongly suggests that the killer had at least some knowledge of human anatomy. This has led many to speculate that Jack the Ripper could have been a surgeon, butcher, or someone with similar medical training. Modern forensic analysis has reaffirmed this theory, with experts noting that the killer's ability to remove organs with such precision was not typical of an average criminal. Today, forensic pathologists can conduct detailed crime scene analysis and use their findings to build a psychological profile of the killer. By studying the way the murders were committed, they can offer insights into the Ripper's potential motivations and personality traits. However, the lack of definitive evidence and the passage of time complicates these efforts. Despite the advancements in forensic technology, identifying Jack the Ripper remains a monumental challenge. Over 130 years have passed since the murders, and much of the evidence has deteriorated or been lost. Many of the original crime scenes have been altered or built over, making it impossible to return to the exact locations for further examination. Additionally, the absence of eyewitness testimony and the fact that the police were working with limited resources at the time means that many important details were either overlooked or lost in the confusion. The combination of poor record-keeping, limited technology, and the changing nature of the crime scenes has made the task of identifying the killer even more difficult. Despite these challenges, the case of Jack the Ripper continues to intrigue modern investigators. New theories and new technologies are being employed to try to solve the mystery once and for all. In recent years, there have been renewed efforts to apply modern criminal profiling to the case, using techniques that were not available to Victorian police. One promising avenue of research is the use of advanced algorithms and data analysis to re-examine witness testimony and crime scene data. By cross-referencing information about the victims, the times of the murders, and the locations, modern investigators are hoping to uncover patterns that were previously overlooked. The advent of genetic genealogy is also offering new possibilities. By tracing distant relatives of potential suspects, researchers may be able to identify the killer, even if direct DNA evidence is unavailable. While this approach has worked in other high-profile cold cases, it remains to be seen whether it can be applied to the Jack the Ripper case. Despite the many advances in forensic science, Jack the Ripper's true identity continues to elude us. The combination of time, a lack of solid evidence, and the mysteries surrounding the case make it one of the most enduring unsolved crimes in history. But the quest for answers remains relentless, and new tools and theories may one day bring us closer to uncovering the truth. For now, the legend of Jack the Ripper persists, a haunting figure in the history of crime. But with each new discovery, we are reminded that the search for answers is far from over. Perhaps, in time, the truth will finally come to light. For over 130 years, the identity of Jack the Ripper has sparked countless theories. While a few suspects have stood out in the investigation, many alternative explanations have also emerged. In this section, we'll explore some of the more unconventional and, at times, controversial theories about who Jack the Ripper really was. These theories have intrigued historians, criminologists, and conspiracy theorists alike. Could the killer have been someone no one suspected? Was there more to the case than we ever realized? As the investigation continued to falter in the face of scant evidence, a wide array of alternative explanations began to surface. From multiple killer theories to royal conspiracies, The possibilities were endless, and the mystery only deepened. Let's take a closer look at some of the more outlandish, yet captivating theories that have taken root over the years. One theory that has gained traction over the years is the idea that Jack the Ripper wasn't a single individual, but rather a group of killers working together. The multiple killer theory suggests that the murders were committed by more than one person, possibly with different motives or methods, but all targeting prostitutes in Whitechapel. This idea stems from the fact that, while the first few murders seemed to follow a pattern, the killing styles began to vary slightly as the spree continued. The main argument for this theory lies in the differences between the killings. Some ripperologists argue that the first few murders, including Mary Ann Nichols and Annie Chapman, seem to follow a very specific and calculated pattern, while the later killings, particularly that of Mary Jane Kelly, appear to be much more brutal and chaotic. Could this suggest the presence of more than one killer, with one continuing the murders after another left the scene? The idea of a copycat killer has also been suggested. Some believe that after the media frenzy surrounding the first few murders, other individuals might have been inspired to mimic the Ripper's style of killing. If multiple killers were involved, they might have acted independently or in a twisted partnership to create an even greater terror. Perhaps the most sensational and widely debated theory is the royal conspiracy theory. According to this theory, Jack the Ripper wasn't just a lowly criminal from the streets of Whitechapel, but rather a member of the British royal family. Specifically, some theorists point to Prince Albert Victor, the Duke of Clarence, as the killer. This theory suggests that Prince Albert Victor, who was reportedly involved in a scandalous affair with a prostitute, was driven to commit the murders to cover up his illicit behavior. Some claim that the royal family, in an effort to protect their reputation, orchestrated a cover-up to conceal the prince's involvement. According to this theory, the Ripper's killings were a desperate attempt to silence the women who knew too much about the prince's secret life. The theory gained popularity in the 1960s and 1970s, thanks in part to books and articles that suggested a hidden royal scandal. Some even claim that the royal family used their power and influence to suppress the truth and divert attention away from the prince. But the theory remains purely speculative, and there's no hard evidence linking Prince Albert Victor to the murders. Despite its sensational nature, the royal conspiracy theory has been widely debunked by historians and experts. But for some, the idea of a royal figure being behind the killings adds an extra layer of intrigue to this already enigmatic case. One of the most unexpected theories surrounding Jack the Ripper is the woman theory, the idea that the killer was not a man at all, but a woman. This theory challenges everything we think we know about serial killers and the gender norms of the time. The woman theory suggests that the Ripper could have been a woman, possibly a midwife, or someone with knowledge of anatomy, who used her role to blend in with the community. Some Ripperologists argue that the mutilations and the precision of the killings might suggest that the killer was familiar with the female body and had a deep resentment toward other women. This would explain the brutal nature of the attacks, as well as the specific targeting of women in the sex trade. This theory has been largely dismissed by mainstream scholars, but it has resurfaced periodically over the years. Some even speculate that the killer may have been a midwife or a woman who had suffered some personal trauma, which led her to lash out at the women in Whitechapel. Another long-standing theory is that Jack the Ripper was a doctor or someone with medical training. This idea comes from the meticulous nature of the mutilations, particularly the removal of organs. Medical professionals, such as surgeons or butchers, would have had the necessary anatomical knowledge to carry out such precise dissection. Some experts point to the fact that the Ripper's ability to remove organs cleanly and efficiently suggests that he was someone familiar with the human body. At the time, medical professionals were often seen as figures of authority, and the idea that the killer might have been hiding in plain sight in the very same area as the murders was a chilling thought. The doctor theory has found support among Ripperologists. but it has never been proven. Still, the possibility that the killer was a medical professional continues to intrigue some. The fact that the murders were so precise and methodical could indicate that the killer had access to surgical tools or was comfortable with handling human bodies. Over the years, countless theories have surfaced, each one adding to the complex puzzle that is Jack the Ripper. Was he a member of the royal family, a doctor with surgical expertise, or perhaps a woman lashing out in anger? The possibilities are endless, and the theories continue to evolve as new evidence emerges, or at times, as new ideas are sparked by the enduring mystery. But the one thing that remains certain is that the true identity of Jack the Ripper continues to elude us. No matter how many theories we consider or how many suspects are named, the killer remains a ghost in the shadows of history. Perhaps one day, the truth will come to light. But for now, Jack the Ripper lives on as one of the most captivating and terrifying figures in the history of crime. More than a century has passed since the grisly murders of Jack the Ripper, and yet the mystery continues to haunt us. New theories continue to emerge, with each new discovery or piece of evidence sparking fresh speculation. With modern forensic science and psychological analysis, new angles are being explored, but so too are older, more outlandish ideas that continue to capture the imagination. In this section, we'll explore some of the more contemporary theories and alternative explanations that have been proposed in the years since the murders. As the search for Jack the Ripper continues, we'll see how our understanding of the case has evolved, and why, despite all the advancements, we still don't know who the killer really was. One of the more unsettling theories is the idea that Jack the Ripper was not one individual, but rather a series of copycat killers who took inspiration from the original murders. This theory suggests that while the first few killings were committed by a single murderer, later crimes may have been imitated by other individuals eager to gain notoriety or to create fear. According to this theory, the subsequent killings may not have been directly linked to the original Ripper, but instead were the result of a crime spree influenced by the initial terror. The public hysteria generated by Jack the Ripper created an atmosphere where others, motivated by fear or desire for fame, might have been emboldened to commit their own gruesome murders in a similar style. This theory is controversial, as there's little evidence to suggest that the Ripper murders were anything but the work of a single individual. However, it adds an intriguing layer of complexity to the case, questioning whether Jack the Ripper's legacy was part of a larger web of violence that grew out of the fear and chaos he created. Perhaps the most fascinating and controversial theories involve the idea of a conspiracy. Some believe that Jack the Ripper's true identity was not just concealed by the killer himself, but by powerful forces seeking to cover up his actions. These conspiracy theories suggest that the police, or even higher authorities, might have been involved in suppressing the truth. The most infamous of these conspiracy theories is one that claims the British royal family was involved in the murders. According to this theory, Prince Albert Victor, the Duke of Clarence, was the actual killer. Some proponents of this theory argue that the prince's connection to a prostitute and his mental instability led him to commit the murders in Whitechapel. Fearing the scandal it would cause, the royal family allegedly orchestrated a cover-up to protect the heir to the throne. This theory has been fueled by the writings of certain authors and researchers, but it remains unproven. Critics argue that there is no solid evidence linking the prince to the murders, and the idea of a royal conspiracy seems more like a sensational tale designed to add intrigue to an already mysterious case. Despite the lack of hard evidence, the royal conspiracy theory continues to capture the imagination of conspiracy enthusiasts. And it remains one of the most talked about aspects of the Jack the Ripper mystery. Another theory suggests that the real identity of Jack the Ripper may have already been discovered, but for reasons unknown, the police decided to close the case without making an arrest. According to this theory, the Ripper's identity was known to a select few, but either through corruption, incompetence, or political pressure, the truth was buried. This theory is based on the idea that some key suspects may have been close to being identified but were quickly dismissed by investigators for various reasons. For example, some believe that one of the initial suspects, like Aaron Kosminski, might have been the killer, but the evidence was not strong enough to charge him. Others suggest that the police were deliberately preventing the case from going public to avoid scandal, or to protect individuals with powerful connections. The notion that Jack the Ripper was quietly caught and his identity concealed adds a layer of intrigue to the mystery. Could it be that the killer was already known to the police, and the case was quietly buried to avoid further embarrassment? It's a theory that continues to divide opinion among experts, and one that adds to the case's enduring enigma. While many theories focus on the identity of the killer, others seek to understand why Jack the Ripper chose his victims. One of the most notable aspects of the murders is that all of the Ripper's victims were women involved in prostitution. This raises questions about the motivations behind the killings, not just who the killer was, but why he specifically targeted these women. Some researchers argue that Jack the Ripper's choice of victims wasn't arbitrary, but was based on deep-seated misogyny and societal disdain for women in the sex trade. Prostitutes were among the most vulnerable members of society, often viewed as disposable by both the public and the authorities. The Ripper's targeting of these women could have been a deliberate act to assert control over those society had marginalized. This theory suggests that the Ripper was not just seeking sexual gratification or revenge, but was also driven by a desire to punish women he saw as immoral or unworthy of compassion. It is possible that he saw these women as objects to be controlled, humiliated, and ultimately destroyed, reflecting the larger gender dynamics and social tensions of the time. As we look back on the case of Jack the Ripper, one thing becomes clear. The mystery continues to captivate and puzzle us because it touches on deep psychological, social, and cultural questions. Who was he? Why did he kill? And what does his legacy say about the world in which these crimes took place? The theories about Jack the Ripper's identity and motivations continue to evolve, and the case remains one of the most compelling unsolved mysteries in history. New technologies, new research, and new theories constantly breathe life into the investigation, ensuring that the quest for the truth will not fade away. As the hunt for the true identity of Jack the Ripper continues, one question persists. Will we ever truly uncover the identity of this monstrous figure, or will he remain forever in the shadows of history? The case of Jack the Ripper is far from over, and perhaps the answers are still waiting to be discovered. It has been over 130 years since the brutal murders of Jack the Ripper shocked London's East End, yet his legacy endures. The question of who the Ripper truly was continues to captivate historians, criminologists, and the general public. As we reflect on this chilling case, we must ask, why does the mystery still hold such a powerful grip on our imaginations? What is it about Jack the Ripper that makes him one of the most infamous figures in history?